In the heart of a modern American city in the year 2025, a storm of pride and vengeance ignites. When young Daniel Carter is humiliated inside St. Gabriel's Catholic Church for mocking the name of Jesus, he calls upon his father, the city's police chief, Marcus Carter. Blinded by rage and arrogance, Marcus unleashes the full force of law enforcement, turning sacred ground into a battlefield. Statues of the Virgin Mary are crushed, the image of Christ is shattered, and the Holy Cross is cast down under boots of authority. Yet the act of desecration awakens a power beyond human comprehension. A divine presence rises from the ruins, and the city trembles as the Carters face a punishment no mortal can escape. This is not just a conflict between men and faith, it is a reckoning that will shake the very soul of America. Dawn rose over the American city like a restless promise, a pale band of light unrolling across glass towers and river fog. In the year 2025, the streets were never truly quiet, not even on Sunday mornings. Delivery vans murmured down the avenues, drones stitched faint lines across the sky, and billboards breathed with the color and motion of a nation that refused to sleep. Yet within the district of red brick townhouses and old elms, where a narrow street led to St. Gabriel Catholic Church, the air held a calmer rhythm. Bells tolled, doors opened. People drifted toward the white steps like small, steady waves. Daniel Carter walked beside Elena Brooks, his anger coiled so tight it felt like a second spine. He kept his hands in his coat pockets and watched the parishioners from the edge of his gaze, as if daring them to look back. Elena held herself with a studied composure that had become her armor in recent weeks. She was 20, a university student with ink on her fingers from late nights in the studio and stubborn ideals in her eyes. Daniel was 22, clever to the point of arrogance, the son of Marcus Carter, the most powerful uniform in the city. The name Carter opened doors without a key. It also closed them, often without warning. They had come to St. Gabriel because Elena wanted to return a small book to the lending shelf near the vestibule. It was a fragile volume of Meditations on Mercy, bound in worn blue cloth. She had borrowed it 2 weeks earlier, when she felt herself slipping into cynicism. Daniel had come because he hated the way the city looked at him now, because he wanted to be seen, because the quiet piety spilling out of the church made his teeth ache. He was an expert at turning fatigue into contempt. He had perfected the posture of the unbothered, but beneath it all sloshed a restless resentment that sometimes made his hands shake. They approached the doors as the last bell faded. An usher nodded with a welcoming smile. Elena returned the nod and stepped into the cool shadow of the nave. Daniel hesitated at the threshold, catching a faint scent of beeswax and incense. The marble floor reflected the colored light of stained glass, which painted soft patches of crimson and gold across his shoes. Up near the altar, a row of candles flickered like small declarations against the vastness of stone. The congregation settled into attention as the priest lifted his hands, and the organ offered a patient chord that unfurled down the aisle. Elena gently placed the blue book on the shelf, then looked at Daniel. He was scanning the statues with a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. The statue of the Virgin Mary stood near the front, tender and luminous, with her gaze turned slightly downward, as if listening to something beyond speech. The crucifix above the sanctuary held the figure of Christ with a gravity that drew the eye and stilled the tongue. The church was not grand by the standards of the city, yet there was an honest beauty in its proportions, as if the builders had meant to give ordinary people a place where their souls could lift their heads. Elena whispered that they should sit for a few moments. Daniel shrugged and followed her into a pew near the middle. He drummed his fingers on the wooden rail. He watched a mother settle her little boy with the determined tenderness that mothers use when they are holding the line. He watched an elderly man bow his head and press his wrinkled knuckles to his lips. The quiet began to irritate him because it did not include him. He was a presence here, but not the center, and that small demotion hummed in his blood like static. The priest, Father Thomas Navarro, began the homily with a gentle voice. He spoke of dignity. He spoke of the courage it takes to restrain power and the humility that makes room for mercy. He spoke of the temptation to confuse authority with righteousness and the danger of letting pride write the law in our hearts. His words were not political. They were carefully human, shaped by the desire to shepherd the people in front of him toward a deeper kind of decency. Daniel heard, and each sentence struck him like a fingertip tapping a bruise. Elena noticed the change in Daniel's breathing. She placed her hand lightly on his forearm and asked if he was all right. He said that he was more than all right. He said that he was tired of pretense. He stood, not abruptly but with the deliberate slowness of a man about to deliver a verdict. A few heads turned. Elena whispered his name, but he had already stepped into the aisle. Sunlight from the high windows found his face and set a cold highlight along his cheekbone. He walked toward the sanctuary, and the murmurs followed him like ripples. Father Thomas paused with his hands open in the gesture of a teacher about to ask a question. Daniel reached the front and turned to the congregation as if the pews were rows of jurors. He began to speak. His voice carried easily in the carved stone space. He said that faith was a costume for weak minds. He said that churches were museums of submission. He said that men like Father Thomas spoke of mercy only to keep other men obedient. The words were not original, and they would not have mattered much in another place, another tone, another hour. Here, spoken in this sanctuary, during the sacred rhythm of worship, they fell like darts thrown from a balcony, designed not to persuade but to pierce. Elena felt heat rise to her face and throat. She stood halfway, then sat again, as if afraid that any movement would tear the moment wider. A deacon approached Daniel with a calm posture and asked him to return to his seat. Daniel smiled without warmth and pointed at the crucifix, asking what kind of love required a spectacle of suffering. He stepped toward the altar rail, and the deacon put out a hand, not touching, only offering a boundary. It was then that Father Thomas spoke Daniel's name. He asked him to breathe and to remember that he was among people who wished him well, even if they disagreed with him. The priest did not raise his voice. He did not lean on authority. He simply tried to meet a wounded spirit with steadiness. Daniel heard the gentleness and despised it. He said that kindness was a leash. He said that respect was a trick. He said that he would not be managed by a man in a collar. The usher from the door had moved closer. A second deacon stood near the side aisle. A few parishioners had guided children toward the back with quiet hands and reassuring whispers. The organist kept her fingers resting on the keys, ready to ease the room into a hymn if given the signal. Elena saw the lines in Father Thomas's face deepen. She saw the priest weigh the needs of the many against the danger of indulging the one. Father Thomas told Daniel that he was disturbing the sacred liturgy and that he needed to step outside and let the congregation pray. He said the door was open. He said that no one would shame him for leaving. Daniel looked around at the faces. Some were troubled, some were angry, some were simply sad, as if watching a young man drag a self-inflicted wound through the heart of a community. He felt the gaze of 100 witnesses and mistook it for a challenge. He raised his voice and mocked the invocation that had opened the service. A gasp broke from the pews like a single exhale. The sound was small but sharp. Father Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, then nodded to the usher and the deacon. They stepped forward and asked Daniel to leave. Their tone remained courteous. Their jaws were tight with effort. Daniel laughed and took one slow step backward, as if to test whether the church meant what it said. Elena rose and told him to stop. She called him Daniel in the voice she used when she was trying to remind him that he was not alone. He turned his head a fraction, enough for her to see the glitter of humiliation in his pupils. He hated being asked to behave. He hated feeling smaller than his anger. He hated, most of all, the knowledge that he could not control the room without borrowing his father's shadow. The usher and the deacon moved to flank him. Daniel allowed himself to be guided down the aisle, making a show of calm compliance, the way a man might let himself be escorted out of a restaurant while promising to buy the building in the morning. Near the vestibule, he twisted his arm free and faced the congregation once more. He delivered a final sneer that was as much a plea as a threat, then pushed through the doors into the square sunlight. Outside, the world seemed larger and thinner. Cars hissed along the street. A flock of pigeons lifted and settled on the church roof. The bells, which had begun the hour with promise, now felt like a mild rebuke. Daniel walked down the steps and planted himself on the sidewalk. Elena followed, her face pale with anger and worry. She told him that he had crossed a line. He told her that lines were for the obedient. She asked him to breathe. He said that the decision had already been made. He pulled his phone from his pocket and stared at the name on the screen for a heartbeat that seemed to stretch. Then he pressed call. Miles away, in a building of glass and authority, Marcus Carter was completing a briefing. He was a tall man with a voice that could cut through chaos without shouting. He was respected by his officers and feared by those who mistook his courtesy for softness. He had built his reputation on order, on the visible certainty of control. He had also fed, in private, a quiet pride in the size of his shadow. When the phone buzzed in his jacket, he excused himself from the conference room and stepped into a private corridor where the hum of climate control sounded like measured breath. He saw his son's name and felt the usual mix of tenderness and dread. He answered. The voice that came through was not the voice of a man asking for help. It was the voice of a son wielding his father like a weapon. Daniel told him what had happened, but he told it like a prosecutor, sharpening each point for impact. He said the priest had humiliated him. He said the congregation had enjoyed his shaming. He said that a deacon had put a hand near his shoulder as if he were a criminal. He said that he had been expelled from the church like a trespasser. He said that the church had mocked the Carters by treating his son like an intruder in his own city. Marcus listened, and the corridor seemed to narrow around him. He saw the story not as it was, but as it threatened to become. He saw headlines. He saw footage sliced and captioned by strangers. He saw the look on his son's face when pride was the only bandage he could find. The air in his lungs turned tight and metallic. He told Daniel to stay where he was. He said that he would handle it. He said that no one had the right to insult his family. Elena watched Daniel lower the phone. She saw the small tremor that ran through him and then vanished beneath a practiced stillness. She asked him what he had done. He said that he had simply reminded the city who kept it safe. She told him that this was not safety. He said that this was justice. She looked up at the statue of the angel that crowned the church facade and felt a helplessness that tasted like rust. Inside, Father Thomas had resumed the liturgy with a voice tinged by sorrow. He prayed for a restless young man by name, asking that pride be transformed into courage rather than contempt. He prayed for himself, silently, that he might not return anger for anger. He prayed for the city, because the air felt strange, as if a weather front had turned and was moving in faster than the forecast allowed. On the steps, Daniel lifted his chin. Sirens were not yet audible. Helicopter rotors had not yet disturbed the Sunday light. The square still looked ordinary, but the consequence had already begun, moving through phone lines and protocols, assembling itself from pride and power. Elena felt it approach the way a person feels thunder before it speaks. She reached for Daniel's hand and found it cold as copper. He did not look at her. He looked at the doors he had just left, and he smiled the small, satisfied smile of a man who believes he has placed the world in his debt. In that moment, the city's calm felt like glass. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, a command would soon be spoken. Somewhere in the chambers of authority, a decision had already tilted toward action. And on that quiet street beneath the aging elms, the first part of a reckoning settled into place, as certain as the hour, as inevitable as the crossing of a line that no one could uncross. The call had ended, but its echo reverberated through the corridors of power like the crack of a gavel. Marcus Carter stood in his office, staring at the phone in his hand, the weight of his son's humiliation burning hotter than reason. Outside the window, the city unfurled in glass and steel, an empire of commerce and politics where his badge commanded obedience. Yet, in that moment, the chief of police was not the protector of 1,000,000 lives. He was a father whose pride had been challenged, and the father was stronger than the law. He paced once across the office, shoulders rigid, jaw clenched, and then pressed the intercom. His voice was flat and cold. "Assemble the rapid response units. Full gear. Meet me in the motor pool in 5 minutes." The command fell into the machinery of the department, and the machinery began to move. Phones rang, radios hissed, boots struck polished floors in hurried rhythm. No one asked why. They had long since learned that Marcus Carter did not explain himself twice. In the motor pool, a cavernous chamber smelling of fuel and rubber, engines roared to life. Siren lights flickered and painted the concrete walls in flashes of red and blue. Officers buckled on vests, checked magazines, adjusted helmets. Some exchanged glances but said nothing. A lieutenant named Harris, a veteran with eyes that had seen too much, paused for half a heartbeat as he read the deployment order. A church? It was not written, not explicit, but the destination code was clear enough. He swallowed his protest and lifted his rifle. A career was a fragile thing in the shadow of a man like Carter. Marcus descended the steel steps with the posture of inevitability. His presence stilled the chatter, sharpened the air. He moved among the rows of vehicles like a general among his cavalry. He gave no speech of justification, only the single merciless sentence: "We are going to St. Gabriel's. Nothing stands when we leave." The words fell into the silence, and the silence swallowed them whole. Engines thundered. The convoy spilled into the daylight, tires screaming against the asphalt. Pedestrians on the sidewalks froze as the tide of black and white cruisers streamed past, sirens splitting the Sunday calm. Mothers pulled children close, vendors abandoned carts. In the upper floors of the city, office workers pressed to the glass to watch the storm roll toward the heart of faith. Helicopters lifted from rooftops, blades biting the sky, cameras mounted on their noses like unblinking eyes. The city had seen many parades of power, but never one so heavy with dread. Inside the lead vehicle, Marcus sat rigid, staring straight ahead. The city passed in streaks. His mind replayed Daniel's words again and again. "They shamed me. They mocked us. They treated me like nothing." Marcus was not a man given to superstition, but he believed in legacy, in the permanence of names carved into institutions. The Carters were not to be laughed at. If the church had forgotten, he would remind them. His officers sat beside him in brittle silence, each man and woman feeling the unspoken weight of orders that smelled of blasphemy and vengeance rather than justice. As they approached the old district, the sound of the convoy preceded them. Sirens echoed off brick facades, scattering pigeons, rattling windows. Parishioners still gathered on the steps of St. Gabriel's turned their heads in disbelief. The bells of the church rang on, stubbornly faithful, but the rhythm faltered beneath the wail of approaching force. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts. An old man removed his cap and whispered a prayer. Inside, Father Thomas paused in mid-homily, his voice caught between warning and bewilderment. The first cruisers skidded to a halt before the steps. Doors slammed, boots thundered onto the pavement. Shields were lifted, rifles angled, helmets glinted in the light. The square, moments before a picture of peace, now bristled with the menace of organized power. Neighbors leaned from windows, cell phones rose, streams began to flow into the digital veins of the world. The city would watch this hour from 1,000 angles, though none could stop it. Marcus stepped out of the lead vehicle, his uniform immaculate, his eyes bright with a fever of conviction. He looked at the church not as a sanctuary, but as a fortress of insult. He looked at the statue of the Virgin Mary and saw not tenderness, but defiance. He looked at the cross and saw not salvation but mockery. Behind him, Daniel emerged from another car, his grin wide and reckless. He moved to his father's side, as if claiming ownership of the storm he had unleashed. The boy's arrogance and the father's fury stood shoulder to shoulder, and the line between them vanished. The officers awaited the command, their hands tight on weapons, their breath shallow. A few shifted uncomfortably. One whispered a question to another. "Are we really doing this?" The answer was a grim silence. Marcus raised his arm, then dropped it with a sharp gesture. "Destroy it," he ordered, his voice carrying across the square. "Every wall, every stone, every idol, tear it all down." The words struck like a gavel, and with them, the holy ground became a battlefield. The first shield line advanced. The square erupted in screams, prayers, and the heavy boots of authority. Inside the church, Father Thomas felt the tremor of doors struck by battering rams. He lifted his eyes to the crucifix and whispered that mercy would be tested this day. Parishioners clutched one another, some kneeling, some shouting, some frozen in disbelief. Outside, the saints carved in stone looked down with unchanging faces as men in armor raised weapons against them. Helicopters hovered overhead, their rotors whipping banners into frantic motion. The city, glued to screens, watched the unthinkable unfold. Some cheered in ignorance, believing it a blow against an enemy they had never met. Others wept openly, feeling the weight of sacrilege bleed through pixels and sound. The narrative had already escaped into the world, but the full fury of its consequence had yet to arrive. Marcus Carter stood at the base of the steps, arms crossed, eyes blazing. Daniel beside him lifted his chin, basking in the performance of vengeance. They believed they were writing a chapter of dominance. What they could not see was the shadow rising behind their pride, an ancient reckoning that waited in silence, patient as eternity, ready to strike when the desecration was complete. The order had been given, and once it left Marcus Carter's lips, there was no air left in the square that could undo it. The command rolled outward like a thunderclap, striking every officer in range, shaking the congregation that had barely managed to spill onto the steps, freezing Elena Brooks in place with dread. "Destroy it," he had said, and those words became a sentence against walls that had stood for over a century. The first shield line surged up the marble stairs, the thud of boots blending with the clash of steel on stone. A battering ram struck the oak doors of St. Gabriel's, the sound like a cannon against the morning air. Splinters burst outward, parishioners screamed, and the faithful who had remained inside rushed to shield the altar with their bodies. Candles toppled, flames guttering in the draught of chaos. The crucifix swayed under the tremor, as if even the carved Christ felt the quake of man's defiance. Daniel Carter stood on the steps with a look of smug triumph. His eyes glimmered with the satisfaction of revenge unfolding in flesh and steel. He turned to his father and spoke, his voice carrying over the roar. "Now they will understand who holds power in this city." Marcus nodded once, his jaw set, his face an iron mask. Yet somewhere deep, far beneath the armor of authority, a whisper of unease stirred, but pride is louder than conscience, and Marcus silenced it with a glare at the holy walls. The officers swarmed into the nave. Statues that had stood watch over generations were the first victims. One fell with the crack of stone against tile, the face of the Virgin Mary shattering into 1,000 pieces. Another was dragged down by ropes, crashing onto the pews below, splinters and fragments raining like judgment across the floor. Worshippers wailed. A woman clutched the broken hand of a saint as though it were still alive. Father Thomas stood rooted, trembling but unyielding, his voice hoarse as he cried out, "You do not know what you are doing." But the roar of boots drowned him out. A squadron advanced to the sanctuary. They pulled down the crucifix, the wooden cross groaning as nails gave way. The figure of Christ fell face first onto the marble. Some officers hesitated, their breaths catching, but Marcus barked from outside, "Finish it," and finish it they did. The crucifix was trampled beneath black boots until the body splintered and the cross lay in ruins. The choir loft shook as another team smashed stained glass windows. Shards of crimson and sapphire rained down, scattering across the floor in a glittering parody of light. Sunlight rushed into the void, harsh and unfiltered, slicing through the nave like blades. The organ pipes were torn from their housings, the music of centuries silenced with a screech of metal. Every strike was both physical and symbolic. Each blow aimed not only at stone and wood, but at the spirit of those who believed. Outside, the crowd had swelled. Neighbors, strangers, passers-by all stood in shock, filming with trembling hands, whispering in disbelief. Some shouted for the police to stop. Others dropped to their knees, clutching rosaries, tears streaking their faces. Children buried their cries against their mothers' chests. The bells above, automated and defiant, still chimed their rhythm as if the church itself refused to yield. But one by one, the bells were silenced when officers cut the cords, leaving the tower mute. Daniel laughed, a short, sharp sound, and shouted at the priests, "Where is your God now? Where is your power?" He kicked a broken statue at his feet, sending fragments of Mary's face skittering across the steps. Elena recoiled at his side, horrified by the venom in his voice. She whispered, "Daniel, this is madness." But he ignored her, intoxicated by the sight of desecration. Marcus scanned the scene with grim satisfaction. He had brought the church low, he believed. He had avenged his son's wounded pride. Yet, when his gaze landed on Father Thomas, still standing upright, still refusing to flee, Marcus felt a flicker of doubt. The priest's eyes, wet with grief, bore into his with an expression that was neither hatred nor fear, but sorrow, deep enough to drown in. Marcus looked away, but the weight of that gaze clung to him like chains. Inside, officers overturned pews, tore hymnals, and scattered chalices across the floor. The altar itself cracked beneath their blows. The Holy Sacrament was spilled, and a hush fell among those watching, as if even the officers themselves realized they had crossed a boundary that could not be uncrossed. One officer lowered his weapon, murmuring, "This is wrong." Another silenced him with a shove, reminding him of the chief's wrath that hung over them all. By midday, St. Gabriel's stood broken, its heart ripped out. Statues lay in ruins, windows shattered, the altar defiled, the cross destroyed. Dust hung in the air like smoke after a battle. The faithful wept, kneeling among the ruins, their prayers rising into the silence where hymns once dwelled. And then the silence. The convoy stood idle, the crowd stunned, the air heavy as if the city itself held its breath. Daniel smiled broadly, soaking in the spectacle. He turned to Marcus. "They will never humiliate me again." Marcus gave a curt nod, but his stomach knotted as he noticed the sky darken, though no storm had been forecast. Clouds swirled above with unnatural speed, shadows bleeding into the streets. The air grew electric, prickling against the skin of everyone present. The desecration was complete, and the moment of triumph lingered for only a heartbeat before the first rumble of judgment rolled across the heavens. The sky above the city dimmed as though some colossal hand had drawn a veil across the sun. Shadows lengthened unnaturally fast, pouring down the streets like black water. The square outside St. Gabriel's fell into a hush, broken only by the rustle of uneasy bodies and the restless whine of helicopter rotors overhead. The ruin of the church lay exposed walls fractured, stained glass reduced to jagged dust, statues of saints ground into rubble. And yet, even in its brokenness, the silence carried an eerie weight, as though heaven itself were listening. Daniel Carter tilted his head back, laughing at the sudden darkness. "Look at this," he said loudly, his voice cutting across the murmurs of the crowd. "Even the sky hides from us. Nothing stands in our way now." His laughter was brittle, edged with triumph, yet when lightning clawed across the clouds, illuminating his face in stark white, a flicker of unease shadowed his grin. Marcus Carter stood with arms folded, his badge glinting dully. He had spent decades commanding storms of human chaos, riots, fires, wars of crime, but this silence was unlike any he had mastered. The air tasted of iron, thick and electric. His officers shifted on their feet, exchanging wary glances. One muttered under his breath, "Chief, something's wrong." Marcus silenced him with a glare, but the truth gnawed even at him. Then came the sound, not thunder, not wind, a voice. It rolled from the heavens and from the ground beneath, reverberating inside every chest, impossibly vast and intimate all at once. "You profaned what is holy. You raised your hand against my house, against my son, against my mother. Judgment is upon you." Gasps rippled through the square. Some fell to their knees instinctively, others clutched their children tight. Father Thomas Navarro, standing amid the wreckage, closed his eyes as tears streaked down his face. "Kyrie eleison," he whispered. "Lord, have mercy." Daniel sneered, though his face had gone pale. "A trick," he spat. "A trick of sound, a trick of fear, nothing more." He raised his fist defiantly toward the sky. "If you are real, strike me down, prove it." The words had barely left his lips when lightning split the heavens. A spear of blinding fire slammed into the pavement at his feet, and the ground cracked wide. Daniel screamed as the light enveloped him, his body convulsed, his skin blanching to ash before the eyes of the horrified crowd. In seconds, he crumbled, scattering in the wind like dust torn from an old book. Elena shrieked, falling to her knees, hands clutching at the empty air where Daniel had stood. Marcus staggered back, his iron mask shattered. "Daniel!" he roared, voice ragged, reaching toward the swirling ashes. His authority, his pride, his rage, all fell silent in the face of loss. He collapsed to his knees, fists striking the ground. "Take me instead," he begged hoarsely. "Punish me, not him. Spare my son." But the voice answered, "Your pride commanded this hour. Your hand unleashed the destruction, and pride is the seed of ruin." The earth beneath Marcus shuddered. Cracks split the pavement, running like veins toward the broken church. Heat poured upward as if the depths of the earth had opened. Marcus's officers backed away in terror. The chief clawed at the ground, his nails breaking as he tried to hold on. "Mercy!" he shouted. "Mercy, please!" The fissure widened. With a final cry, Marcus was swallowed whole. The ground sealed above him as if nothing had ever been disturbed. Only the echo of his voice lingered, fading into silence. The crowd erupted in cries. Some screamed, some prayed, some simply wept. Elena collapsed in sobs, unable to comprehend the swiftness of judgment. Father Thomas raised his trembling hands to the heavens. "O God," he whispered, "you have shown us your justice. Spare us now, for we are dust." And as suddenly as it began, the storm began to dissolve. The clouds unraveled, light seeped back into the square. A strange hush followed, heavy yet strangely clean, as though the air itself had been scoured. Where the crucifix had been trampled, the shattered wood stirred, lifted, and reformed. The cross rose from the rubble, whole and radiant, gleaming with a light not of this world. The people gasped, then fell to their knees. No one spoke, no one dared. The judgment was complete, and the lesson carved into the marrow of all who had seen. No power of man, no pride of flesh, could stand against the eternal. The storm had passed, but the city was not the same. Where once the morning had been clear, now a residue of awe hung in the air, a trembling silence that clung to the streets like mist. The square before St. Gabriel's was littered with rubble, shattered glass, and fragments of marble, yet at the center of ruin stood the cross whole, gleaming and unbroken. Light seemed to pour from it, not dazzling but steady, as if to say, "I remain." The officers, who had marched forward with shields and weapons, now stood scattered, their formation broken, their discipline shattered. Some had fallen to their knees in prayer, others had torn off their helmets, faces pale with horror. A few wept openly, whispering apologies to no one in particular. The weight of what they had done pressed down upon them, heavier than any armor. For every stone they had struck, for every sacred thing they had shattered, they now felt the judgment of heaven branded into their souls. In the crowd, people clutched one another. Mothers held children who had seen too much. Fathers bowed their heads, unable to explain what their eyes had witnessed. Strangers embraced like family, bound by terror and wonder. Every phone that had recorded the destruction now trembled in hands that dared not replay what they had seen. For though the world would soon know, those present understood something deeper. This was no spectacle for entertainment, but a testimony carved into eternity. Elena Brooks sat on the steps, her body trembling with grief. Daniel was gone, his laughter and arrogance blown away like dust on the wind. She pressed her face into her hands, unable to reconcile the boy she had loved with the man who had mocked heaven. She remembered his warmth, his stubborn dreams, his reckless humor, and she wept, because love does not vanish, even when judgment is just. She whispered his name into the silence, and the syllables broke her heart anew. Father Thomas Navarro stood in the doorway of the ruined church. His vestments were torn, his hands blackened with soot and dust, but his eyes shone with a quiet fire. He raised his voice, steady though choked with emotion. "You have seen today what pride can bring. You have seen what cannot be destroyed. No hand of man can topple the house of God, for it is not built of stone and glass alone. It is written in eternity." His words carried across the square. The crowd, already humbled, leaned into them as if seeking refuge. Some nodded, tears streaking their faces. Others sank to the ground in prayer. The officers lowered their heads, unable to meet his gaze. The rebuilt cross radiated still, its surface unmarred, though it had been splintered only minutes before. People approached slowly, reverently, afraid to come too close. A child slipped from his mother's grasp and toddled forward, placing a tiny hand against the base. The crowd gasped, but the child only smiled, bathed in the glow. A murmur spread, a sign, a gift, a proof of mercy after wrath. News spread faster than any storm. By the afternoon, screens across the nation were filled with footage of the destruction and the miracle. Commentators stammered, politicians argued, skeptics scrambled for explanations. Some claimed it was staged, some called it divine, some whispered it was the beginning of the end. But those who had been there needed no debate. They had heard the voice. They had seen the ash of a son and the swallowing of a father. They had felt the quake of the ground beneath their feet. No argument could strip the truth from their bones. In the days that followed, St. Gabriel's became a place of pilgrimage. People came not to admire architecture, most of it was still rubble, but to kneel before the cross that had risen whole. Flowers filled the steps, candles burned day and night, songs of lament and hope echoed through the ruined walls. Even skeptics who came to mock left in silence, unsettled by the weight in the air. The police department stood in disgrace. Marcus Carter's name was etched not in honor, but in infamy. Officers resigned in shame, others came forward to confess the torment in their conscience. The city council convened emergency sessions, but no law could undo what had been done. For the first time in memory, authority bowed its head, humbled not by protest, but by heaven itself. Elena, still grieving, found herself returning again and again to the steps. She would sit among the flowers, whispering prayers she was not sure how to form. Father Thomas comforted her gently, reminding her that love does not die with the body, that mercy reaches even where judgment falls. But she could not yet find peace. She looked at the cross and asked why. Why Daniel? Why Marcus? Why so merciless and yet so merciful in the same hour? No voice answered, but the silence itself seemed to hold her questions tenderly, as though eternity had heard and kept them. One evening, as the sun set behind the shattered bell tower, Father Thomas gathered the crowd for prayer. His voice carried, strong yet compassionate. "Let this be a warning to us all," he said. "Pride destroys, power corrupts, vengeance blinds, but faith endures. The cross will stand when all else falls. Remember this and pass it to your children, that they may never forget what happened here. For God is not mocked, and no man is greater than his word. He's into the come." The people bowed their heads, and the square filled with the sound of whispered prayers. Some wept quietly, others sang broken hymns. Above them, the cross gleamed as the last rays of sunlight bathed it in fire. And in that moment, the city seemed to breathe again, not as it had before, careless and proud, but with the trembling reverence of one who has touched the edge of eternity and lived to tell the tale. The house of God had been desecrated, but in its ruin, a warning had been carved into the heart of America. Pride falls, judgment comes, and the eternal endures.